Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic. It's September 4th or 5th here, I believe, on a Wednesday at 1 p.m. in Los Angeles. Today we're going to be taking a deeper look at step 3, at least the preface to step 3, but let's pray for an open mind and an open heart, that attitude that will take us to a place that we don't even know exists. Please join me. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Welcome to our Big Book 12-step telephone video conference workshop. The homework for today was to take a look at the beginning of step 3, as I mentioned, the preface, as I call it, pages 58 to 60. We're on assignment 9, but it's progressive. And next week, we will continue with assignment 9. And that would be a special focus on pages 62 and 63. It's really dense material. Page 62 and 63 make reference to relationships. My experience and understanding of step 3 is a relationship. Step 1, we come to grips with not effective sufficient power, both with regard to our addiction, but especially with regard to our life, unmanageability, and that we need some type of power that will be effective, usually other than human power. That's the tenet in the Big Book, of course. God as we don't understand it, a higher power, a power other than ourselves. And in step 2, we name that power. That's the invitation. There's no dogma to learn. There are no vocabulary to memorize or to understand in the Big Book. There's some suggestions and some questions to ask yourself. But the answer is yours. God is or God isn't. What is your choice? Where and how are we going to find that power is the question at the beginning of chapter 4. And at the end of chapter 4, I asked you to ask yourself, what concept do you need? What attributes and qualities do you want? So that you form by your decision, man, that's empty, thin, dark, insubstantial, immaterial. There's no certitude. There's no feeling attached to it necessarily. It's just a raw decision on your part. God is. Power is. And today, what I need that power to be is, and you fill in the blank, 1 or 2 or 3 words. Step 2 is about a decision about power. Step 3, that's a decision for a relationship with that which you made a decision about in step 2. The big book doesn't say that as clearly as I'm saying it. We'll talk a little bit about that today, but much more of it next week when we look at relationships, because that's the content of that material on the bottom of page 62 and the top of page 63. And the paragraph at the top of 63 are the promises of step 3. Spend some time looking at those promises, unpacking them to the best of your ability, understanding what is promised as a result of step 3. What is step 3? Says it right on page 159. Made a decision. Oh, the step is quite clear in contrast to step 2. Step 2 wasn't that clear. Step 2 says, came to believe. Now, with some experience, I know that that's a process. With some understanding of chapter 4, I know it's a decision. Not because chapter 4 says that, but it implies that. God is or God isn't. What's your choice? Where and how are we going to find this power? What's your choice? A decision about power. Now in step 3, we're going to have a warm-up exercise on pages 58, 59, and 60 in preparation for understanding what he concludes with on page 60. Made a decision to turn. Well, that's not passive. It's very rigorously, vigorously active. Made a decision. Again, like step 2, made a decision. It's not surrender. For the longest period of time, I used the term surrender with regard to step 3 because I heard it in a meeting and it sounded cool. And then I took another deeper look at step 3. Surrender is a proper word for step 1. I'm completely defeated. I surrender. I give up. I need help. But step 3 is a ferocious act of my will. I make a decision to turn. My decision, my turning. I make a decision to turn my will and my life. What's that? We'll address that as the book asks that question later on. What does that mean? My will, my life. And it doesn't say we turn it over to God. Pay attention to the step. Turn it over to the care of God. That is not subtle, and yet it's very misunderstood. A decision to have a relationship, which is my understanding now. And you might ask yourself as part of the assignment going forward, what relationship does your heart yearn for? I love that richness of that word. Yearn for. Perhaps the word or the concept that you chose for step 2 will connote that. We'll look at all of that next week. Notice that the assignment for next week, the completion of assignment 9, suggests that you pay attention to the prayer on page 63. I think it's the second or the third paragraph, second paragraph probably. And that you write your own third step prayer. Again, not to improve it, but to understand it. If you have to put it into your own words, then you have to get underneath the words in the book, actual words of step 3, to understand them, to put them in your own words. Let's take a look at page 58. If you have your book, it would be appropriate for you to look at it. In AA, the program that I'm in that fellowship. Almost at every meeting, chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5 is read. It's a practice that started here in California, actually, in the mid-40s, early 40s probably. They finally had the book in 1939, and somebody brought it to California, but they didn't know what to do with it. They had just started having meetings, and they didn't know how to run a meeting. And somebody in the room said, well, we have this book, and it's got a chapter 5 that says how it works. Why don't we read the beginning of that chapter, perhaps to give the meeting some direction as to how this thing works? No, seriously. And it was an Al-Anon person. It wasn't even an alcoholic. It was a woman. In that meeting, she was hosting it at her house. And she's the one that made that suggestion. And it took root, of course, because now that's pretty traditional in the culture of AA generally to read. And because it's read at every meeting, people hear it all the time and become quite used to it, AKA brain dead to it. They don't hear it any longer because they've heard it so often. And they'd rather think about after the meeting and the grocery list or the coffee clutch or the burden of relationship that they might have after the meeting. So that's a great time because nothing's happening other than the reading of how it works. I hope you're smiling because it's just amazing how it works. Here it is. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Well, what's the key word there? Thoroughly. Of course. What does that mean? Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program. Wow. Completely. What does that mean? Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being dishonest with themselves. Now, this is such an important concept. Bill spends 3 or 4 lines, a couple sentences, actually, unpacking that. I don't believe it's understood, generally, what Bill is attempting to say here. Men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. Constitutional, what does that mean? In their very structure, in their biology, in their physiological constituents or structure. They do not have the capacity to be honest. Constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. This is not about emotional and mental and denial and ignorance. No, that's not what this is saying. He goes on to make sure that we understand it. There are such unfortunates, constitutionally incapable. Most of you are not in that category. You've had difficulty. You've been in denial. You've been ignorant, meaning not knowing. You've been resistant. You've been negative. But that's not what he's talking about here. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. Oh, we're talking about organic. We're talking about biology. Perhaps a retarded person. Perhaps a psychotic person. Perhaps a sociopath or a psychopath. I'm not a professional. I don't want to get all tangled around in vocabulary. But you get the implication of what I'm saying. These are people who do not have the innate, natural, organic, biological, physiological capability of being honest. They're cut off from reality constitutionally, irreparably, irredeemably. They are naturally incapable by their very nature of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. So he's telling us that this is part of the principle of recovery, that we have the capacity to grasp and develop a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Rigorous. If you don't really understand the connotation of that word, look it up. Rigorous. I actually like the word radical. It's not in the big book, but it takes it a little bit deeper, I think. Radical, coming from the Latin word radix, meaning root. At the root, I have the ability to be honest. I was a very dishonest person with myself. I didn't know that. And with others. That was just my way of manipulation and getting what I wanted. And I was conscious of most of it. Their chances are less than average. All right, so he's not writing them off, but he is saying, wow, their chances are less than average. Now he takes us to the majority. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders. Notice, he's giving us two categories, emotional and mental. So even with some psychiatric problems, then certainly there were medications. Now we've got wonderful medications and services that help people with mental disorders. Many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest, so he's emphasizing it again. The emotional and mental grave disorders might rule out their capacity, meaning their ability, their organic functionality. It may, but he's saying they can recover if they develop the capacity to be honest. This is critical. So then he goes on. Our stories disclose in a general way. This is almost a formula for most speakers or for sharing in a meeting, actually. What we used to be like. Notice it doesn't say what it used to be like. No, what I used to be like. Then what happened and what am I like now? It is about me sharing my experience, sharing my story, sharing the life of addiction that I had and whatever the precipitating event was that brought me into the program and began to transform me. And now what I'm like now, what's the purpose of that? To impress people? No, not at all. To allow people to identify with it. Oh, I'm like that now. Oh my God. He did the steps and now his life is flourishing. Well, I want what that person has. I guess I'll do what that person did. It's as simple as that. And I may not know what this person has, but I know what I have, and I don't want what I have. This person seems to be dealing pretty reasonably with life. I think I'll follow them, do what they did, ask them for help, ask them for suggestions, and take actions that are actually contrary to my inclination, contrary to my thoughts, contrary to my understanding, contrary to my feelings, contrary to my history. I'm going to do things differently. That's the beauty of the set-aside attitude in prayer. It's a conscious commitment. Whether you think of it as a prayer or a positive affirmation, it doesn't make any difference, because that prayer changes me. That prayer is absorbed into me as an attitude, and I've invited it. I'm conscious of it. If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, now you hear that all the time. Are you willing to go to any length? Well, what does that mean? I mean, most of us have enough self-respect and fear to say, yeah, well, you know, I am, but what is it? What are you implying? What does it mean? The big book doesn't leave us there to speculate. It gives us the answer. There's a dash. If you are willing to go to any length to get it, dash, then you are ready to take certain steps. As I said, this is the prelude to the third step. And the third step, Bill says, is a beginning to the process of transformation. It's only a beginning, the third step. It's a commitment, it's a decision, it's a prayer. So it's a little bit of action. But he's soon after his instructions on the third step, as he's approaching the fourth step, says, nothing's going to happen unless you get into immediately the fourth step, and each step thereafter in some type of an organic, progressive development. Not waiting, not delaying, not rushing. And there's no time frame. It's your path. And there's an order to it. There's an order, a progression of integration. You will note that all of the even steps are naming steps. All of the odd steps are decision and action steps. It's a fabulous insight. I'm human because I can know. I have a brain that can self-reflect. I have a mind that allows me to know that I know, to transcend myself. But I also have a function called free will. I can make a decision and take voluntary action. That's how I'm built as a human being. I have a mind and I have a will. We saw that in step one. Step two was, in fact, presented to us in a way that we could understand faith using that dynamic of body, mind, and will. And here we are again in step three, made a decision. The use of our free will. Willing to make that decision. And the man who took me through the steps said, her willingness without action is fantasy. Don't tell me you've taken the third step unless you're working on the fourth step. Because third step's only a prayer, and it's a public prayer, and it's a public commitment. Because the book says we suggest you take it with somebody else. We'll talk about that next week. At some of these we balked. Well, I hope you looked up the term balk. I'm familiar with it from the baseball world. I don't know much about baseball. But I know that balking is when the pitcher gets into motion and stops halfway, doesn't follow through with his motion, and there's a penalty. It's called a balk. I don't know what the penalties are, but there's a penalty. When he says, at some of these we balked, at some of these we started the steps, but we didn't complete step 4. Or having done step 4, we didn't do step 5. Or having done step 5, we didn't do 6 and 7. Or having done 6 and 7, we didn't do 8 and 9. And even if we started 8 and 9, we didn't complete it. I hope you're listening. I hope you're asking yourself, have I completed my 9th step? Now, if this is your first journey, of course, you haven't. But if you've been around for a while and you think you've done the steps, I'm challenging you to challenge yourself. Have you finished your 9th step? I hear in the rooms, oh, you'll never finish your 9th step. It's BS. I've done the work 4 times. I've finished my 9th step 4 times. Finish my 9th step. We'll talk about it when we get there. Dead people, people that you can't find, people that you shouldn't find. How do you ever finish your amends? I'm going to share my experience with you. Creatively, spiritually, maybe not physically, but there's a way to finish your amends. And that's where you want to be, on the other side of 9. That's where the freedom is. At some of these we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. I can want to be fearless and thorough. I can pray to be fearless and thorough. I don't know whether I can be fearless and thorough. I'm going to do the best I can. And that's it right there. Please adopt that. Please embrace that, especially you perfectionists. Progress, not perfection. Embrace that you will do the best that you can, knowing that it's not the best that you can. And it's okay, because it is the best that you can. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go. Absolutely. We grounded ourselves on that phrase right in the first day of our workshop. That's the foundation of the set-aside attitude and the set-aside prayer. Remember that we deal with alcohol, we deal with addiction. Cunning, baffling, powerful. Without help, it is too much for us. There is one who has all power. This is now the tenet of step 2, of course. We've come out of step 2. We're transitioning. We're getting prepared for step 3. There is one who has all power. Is that a component of your step 2 concept? Power? Would be logical if, in fact, step 1, you experience lack of power. Then in step 2, what do you need? I need power, some form of power. That one is God. May you find God now. That's what this is. This is about a journey. The book, the steps, the sponsor, the step guide, they're all pointing the way. They're not the way, but they're pointing the way to the light. Half measures availed us nothing. Well, you'd think if you did kind of like half of, you'd get half. Luke says no. Half measures availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point, made a decision to turn. Bill has wonderful internal integrity in the big book. Here it is. We stood at the turning point. Remember in step 2, I hope that we looked at this. I'm not sure we did, but we're looking at it now. The second half of Bill's story. We read the first half of Bill's story in the first step. I intended to read the second half of Bill's story in the second step. I'm not sure we did that, but you can do that on your own. But right now I'm referring to page 14. Simple but not easy. A price has to be paid. This program is simple. It's not easy. A price has to be paid. Well, what's that? It says right here. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. Oh, yeah. That's what we saw in unmanageability, page 62. Selfishness, self-centeredness is the root of the problem. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. That's the price we need to pay. The Oxford group calls this soul surgery. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. There it is. A recap. Steps 1, 2, and 3. Right here. Page 14, Bill's story. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. Made a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care. We stood at the turning point. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon. The third step instructions, all the way from page 58 through 63, has very high standards, an ideal of perfection, of absolute. I'll point it out when we come to it. It's the one step that has this kind of vision statements, things that we cannot certainly hope to achieve on our own, but perhaps they set standards for us, willing to be taken there as an approximation. We stood at the turning point. We asked. Well, anytime the book suggests that we ask God, that's prayer. See, he's warming us up again to the third step. God's protection and care with complete abandon. Then he lists the steps. We don't need to look at those right now. We'll be absolutely applying each of them over the next several months to our own personal lives. On page 60, many of us exclaimed, what an order, after we read those 12 steps. It's quite a formula. I can't go through with it. Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. Of course, we're human beings. We're flawed. We're material. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles. Now, Bill doesn't use the same word in consecutive sentences. So rather than use the word steps, he gives us a synonym here, principles. That's a synonym for the steps he's just listed on pages 59 and 60. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. Dimmer switch, going up a notch at a time, infinitely for an entire lifetime. There's no there. The journey is the destination. Most people don't even begin the journey. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, chapters 1, 2, and 3. The chapter to the agnostic, chapter 4. And our personal adventures before and after, before coming into the program, after being in the program, make clear 3 pertinent ideas. So now he's looking back over his shoulder, giving us a context, because he's about to take us into some frontier territory, brand new territory. Number 1, that we were alcoholic, we were addicts, and could not manage our own lives. First half, second half of the first step. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. That's the conclusion from step 1. The springboard to step 2, I need a power other than human power. C, that God could, step 2, and would, step 3, if God were sought. God could has the power, and would has the caring. Now we know in step 3 that that word is pivotal. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God. Being convinced we are at step 3. He tells us exactly for the very first time where we are. He has not told us before where we are in step 1. He has not told us where we are in step 2. He's never articulated it, but here he does it in italics. Now, you're at step 3. He's given us a context and a preface, which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to God as we understood God. And then again, as he has done in a literary style, he asks the question, well, what do we mean by that? And what do we do? Perfect. Remember I said the steps are, even steps are naming steps, and the odd steps are decision and action steps. That's the question. Well, what do we mean? Naming this power and the process. And what do we do? Specifically, what are the instructions for action? Well, we looked at the answer to that first question when we looked at pages 60, 61, and 62. Those were the pages we used to understand what unmanageability meant, what the spiritual malady meant. Selfishness and self-centeredness, and we're powerless, and we can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power, was the conclusion of paragraph 2 on page 62. You may revisit that in the context of step 3. That's fine. That's not part of the instruction, but obviously it might be helpful. But then take a look at page 62 in the paragraph that begins, this is the how and the why of it, as the answer to what do we do? Page 60 to 62 answers the question, what do we mean? What we mean is that we're selfish and self-centeredness, and we can't reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. So we had to have God's help. Well, what do we do? Page 62 and 63 answers that question. And that's what we'll pick up next week. All right. And so the Serenity Prayer is a prayer for dealing with reality as it is. I can't see reality as it is. I only see reality as a projection of me. And this whole process that we're about to have in a couple of weeks, the beginning of the 4th step, is going to give us a new pair of glasses so that we can actually see reality more clearly as reality is. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.